The snow was heavy on the ground that morning in February 2001, the kind that muffles sound and makes a city feel smaller. And in Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, a man in his 50s moved slowly toward a footbridge he knew too well. He wore glasses, his shoulders hunched, his face the careful mask of someone who has been living with secrets for too long. In his hand he carried a plastic garbage bag that looked unremarkable. Inside it were packages of information meant for a foreign power, the latest in a series of betrayals that had bled the United States for more than 2 decades. What he did not know was that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already surrounded the park. As he placed the bag under the bridge, the signal he had used many times before, agents moved in. Robert Philip Hanssen, a senior counterintelligence agent, the man responsible for the most damaging espionage case in the Bureau's history, was finally under arrest. These records are drawn from declassified files and public archives. Leave a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Like and subscribe for more declassified stories. The image is almost cinematic. A devout churchgoer, a husband and father of 6, an agent trusted to protect America's deepest secrets, brought down at a park bench drop site with a trash bag in his hand. But beneath the drama of that arrest lies a quieter, more corrosive story of how one man, armed with access and patience, sold out his colleagues, his country, and dozens of human lives for money, for ego, and for reasons that still leave historians debating what truly drove him. From 1979, when he first reached out to Soviet intelligence, to 2001, when he was finally caught, Hanssen compromised at least 50 US operations. He revealed the identities of American agents working inside Russia, handed over details of highly sensitive surveillance programs, exposed how the United States tracked Soviet and later Russian communications, and delivered intelligence that helped Moscow fortify itself against American eyes. Intelligence officials later testified that his disclosures led directly to the execution of at least 3 US assets inside Russia. He received more than $1.4 million in cash and diamonds for his treachery, though colleagues would later note that his suburban lifestyle hardly reflected such wealth. Robert Hanssen was not the kind of man who attracted notice in the halls of the Bureau. Born in 1944 in Chicago, the son of a Chicago police officer known for his severity, Hanssen grew up with a mix of discipline and resentment that never quite left him. He studied chemistry at Knox College, married Bonnie Walk, a devout Catholic, in 1968, and soon turned toward law enforcement and intelligence work. By 1976, he had joined the F.B.I., assigned to field officers, before moving into the counterintelligence branch in New York. In the beginning, he seemed like a man trying to fit the mold of the Bureau's expectations, conservative in dress, serious in manner, committed to his Catholic faith. He and his wife became active in Opus Dei, the Catholic lay organization known for its strict observances. Friends from his parish would later recall that he led Bible study, that he sat in the front pews, that he carried himself with the gravity of a man who believed in order and duty. But even then, there were cracks in the facade. He lived with a sense of grievance, of being overlooked by his superiors, of being underpaid, undervalued, and underappreciated. It was a resentment that grew quietly and that Soviet intelligence would one day exploit. His first contact with Soviet handlers came in 1979, barely 3 years into his bureau career. Without the FBI's knowledge, he wrote to the Komité Gosudasvenoi Bezopasnosti (KGB), offering classified information. Unlike some who stumble into espionage through coercion, Hanssen approached them directly, a volunteer. The records of those first deliveries remain partial, but they included details about Soviet defectors and American surveillance efforts. He received cash in return, though not extravagant sums. He kept his family in a modest house in Scarsdale, New York, drove ordinary cars, attended mass. To outward eyes, he was a man living quietly, even humbly, but beneath that quiet life ran a current of betrayal that would stretch across decades. By 1985, the Cold War was shifting. Ronald Reagan had declared the Soviet Union an evil empire. American defense spending surged, and the FBI and Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, were investing heavily in recruiting and running agents inside the Soviet bloc. This was also the year Aldrich Ames began his catastrophic betrayal from inside the CIA. The confluence of Ames and Hanssen, both feeding Moscow information at the same time, created one of the most dangerous counterintelligence crises in American history. Sources dried up, operations collapsed, and the Soviet Union appeared to have eyes in every American file. Hanssen's method was less flashy than Ames's. He relied on dead drops, leaving packages of classified material under bridges, near fences, or buried in parks, with prearranged signals, a piece of tape on a pole, a chalk mark, an item left in plain sight to tell his handlers where to look. Foxstern Park in Vienna became one of his most infamous sites. Court records show that between 1985 and 1991 alone, he carried out dozens of such exchanges, using locations so ordinary that neighbors jogged past without noticing. He wrote letters to his handlers signed with the alias Ramon Garcia, a name that later appeared in recovered KGB archives. In those letters, Hanssen showed a mix of arrogance and self-justification. He sometimes lectured his handlers on proper tradecraft, warning them to avoid sloppy signals. He claimed to be motivated not only by money, but by a desire to demonstrate his superiority over the bureau that failed to promote him. Yet he was also cautious, careful never to reveal his identity directly to Moscow. He insisted that they not try to meet him face to face, not to photograph him, not to press for details beyond the files he delivered. For more than a decade, this distance protected him. He gave away lives and operations, but he never gave away himself. The information he passed was devastating. Among his betrayals was the disclosure of the US tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington, a multi-million-dollar project meant to tap into Moscow's communications. He exposed the identities of double agents, including Major General Dmitry Polyakov, already betrayed by Ames, but Hanssen's confirmation sealed the Soviets' certainty. He revealed the techniques by which the United States intercepted encrypted communications, giving Russia a roadmap to protect its secrets. In the words of one later declassified damage assessment, he handed Moscow a blueprint of America's counterintelligence programs. By the early 1990s, Hanssen paused his spying. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The KGB had restructured into the Federal Security Service (FSB), and he withdrew, fearing exposure. But the pause did not last. In 1999, he re-established contact, this time using a Palm Pilot and encrypted files as part of his exchanges. The technology had changed, but the method remained the same. Dead drops in suburban parks, coded notes, cash and diamonds left in return. All the while, Hanssen maintained his double life. At home in Vienna, Virginia, he was the stern father, the devout Catholic, the man who went to confession and read scripture. At work, he was the trusted insider, granted access to the Bureau's most sensitive files. He taught younger agents about loyalty, even as he violated it daily. His colleagues noticed quirks, his condescension, his secrecy, his odd fixation on computer systems, but they did not imagine that beneath those quirks lay treachery on a scale the Bureau had never seen. It would take a joint FBI, CIA mole hunt to unravel him, a process marked by suspicion, false leads, and finally the narrow capture in Foxstone Park that ended one of the longest-running betrayals in American intelligence history. The 1980s were a decade of hard lines in Washington. The Cold War had entered a new intensity under Ronald Reagan, with U.S. defense budgets climbing into the hundreds of billions and rhetoric sharpening around the idea of an existential struggle. Inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, F.B.I, counterintelligence against the Soviet Union was not an abstract priority. It was the center of the Bureau's identity. Agents were trained to see Soviet illegals behind every corner, to watch the embassies in Washington and New York, to map contacts, to run surveillance that lasted days on end. Yet, for all that vigilance, the institution carried blind spots. The F.B.I. of that era prided itself on discipline and loyalty, but it also struggled with bureaucracy and outdated methods. Financial auditing of agents was sporadic. Background reinvestigations, once a clearance was granted, could take years to revisit. Polygraph programs existed, but their reliability was overestimated. These gaps created space for someone like Hanssen, who understood the rhythms of the institution, to exploit its trust. Hanssen's professional path intersected with those blind spots in ways that would prove catastrophic. After joining the Bureau in 1976, he moved through assignments in Chicago, New York, and Washington. His early career was unremarkable, the kind of trajectory that left supervisors thinking of him as reliable but not exceptional. He handled Soviet cases in New York, gained access to double-agent files, and studied the Bureau's surveillance methods. By the time he was transferred to headquarters, he had developed a deep knowledge of the very systems meant to catch a traitor. By 1981, Hanssen was stationed in New York, working Soviet counterintelligence cases. Records show that it was during this time that he first attempted to feed information to Moscow, though sporadically, and not at the scale he would later adopt. He tested the waters, gauging the Soviets' interest, and then retreated. But in 1985, the same year Aldrich Ames began his betrayal at the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Hanssen returned to the path with determination. 1985 is often described in intelligence history as the year of the spy. It was the year of John Walker, the Navy warrant officer who sold codes to the Soviets. It was the year of Ames, and it was the year Hanssen decided to fully commit. The confluence of these cases devastated American operations. Within months, agents in Moscow were arrested, networks collapsed, and American counterintelligence chiefs were left wondering how so many leaks could converge at once. Some suspected technical penetration, others whispered about multiple traitors. The reality was both Ames at the CIA and Hanssen at the FBI, each bleeding operations independently. Hanssen's motivation has been debated ever since. Court records and psychological evaluations describe a man who combined arrogance with insecurity. He resented colleagues who advanced more quickly. He believed his intellectual gifts were overlooked. His devout Catholicism, rigid and public, sat uneasily alongside private habits that included secret obsessions with control, surveillance, and sexual domination. Money was part of his motive. The Soviets paid him more than $600,000 in cash and diamonds across the 1980s alone. But it was not the only driver. He craved recognition, even if it came only from the adversary he was supposed to fight. By the late 1980s, Hanssen's access had expanded. He worked on the Soviet analytical desk, handling some of the Bureau's most sensitive penetrations. He read reports from agents inside Moscow. He reviewed surveillance programs targeting Soviet embassies. He understood not just what the United States knew, but how it knew it. That access was priceless to Moscow. His files allowed them not only to identify agents, but to map American methods, to see which communications were vulnerable, to learn where the Bureau placed its listening devices. One of the starkest betrayals of this era was his exposure of the F.B.I.'s tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington, a multi-million-dollar operation designed to capture encrypted conversations. Declassified summaries reveal that Hanssen revealed the existence of the project almost as soon as he learned of it. For Moscow, it was a gift, confirmation that their new building was compromised. For the Bureau, it was a humiliation that only came fully into light years later, when Hanssen's files were reviewed after his arrest. And yet, even as operations collapsed, suspicion often fell elsewhere. The F.B.I. and CIA both struggled to believe that someone so ordinary, so overtly devout, could be the source of the leaks. Investigators chased false leads, polygraphed the wrong people, and delayed financial reviews that would have revealed Hanssen's unexplained wealth. The culture of the Bureau, built on loyalty, trust, and a reluctance to believe the worst about one's own, gave him room to maneuver. By 1991, with the Soviet Union collapsing and American intelligence agencies reorganizing their priorities, Hanssen briefly suspended contact. It was a pause born partly of caution and partly of the geopolitical shift. The KGB was disbanded, the Federal Security Service, FSB, emerged, and the flow of payments temporarily halted. For a time, Hanssen appeared to withdraw into his role as husband, father, parishioner. But betrayal once begun has its own gravity. By 1999, he was back in contact, this time more reckless, using a Palm Pilot and digital encryption as part of his exchanges. The Cold War had ended, but Hanssen's personal war continued. The mandate of American counterintelligence had shifted by then, with terrorism and cyber threats rising. The focus of resources broadened, and the memory of the mole hunts of the 80s faded into background noise. Hanssen exploited that drift. He presented himself as the experienced senior agent, lecturing others on loyalty, all while preparing his next drop. The irony is brutal. The very institution that trained its agents to suspect everyone outside the circle failed to recognize the danger at its center. By the late 1990s, suspicion returned. Unexplained leaks continued to surface. Russian intelligence seemed to anticipate American moves, and internal reviews narrowed the circle of possible moles. Hanssen was back on the radar, though he did not yet know it. The stage was set for the mole hunt that would finally end in Foxstone Park, with a trash bag under a bridge and a career collapsing into handcuffs. His tradecraft was never the elegant, movie script sort of espionage. Robert Hanssen's methods were mundane, repetitive, even sloppy at times, yet devastatingly effective. He understood that the best spy work in a city like Washington is not about disguises and car chases. It is about looking unremarkable while carrying out the extraordinary. The core of his system was the dead drop. From 1985 onward, Hanssen built a steady rhythm of leaving packages in suburban parks and wooded areas of Northern Virginia. He favored Foxstone Park in Vienna, a small strip of suburban green dotted with footbridges and benches, the kind of place where neighbors walked their dogs and children played without a second glance. There, he would tape plastic garbage bags stuffed with documents under bridges, or bury envelopes inside waterproof containers beneath leaves. To signal a drop had been made, he would leave chalk marks on a nearby utility pole or tape a piece of adhesive to a park sign. To the untrained eye, these were meaningless. To Moscow's resident agents, they were the signposts of betrayal. The content of those drops was staggering. Court evidence later showed that Hanssen passed more than 6,000 pages of classified material, ranging from lists of American double agents to details of U.S. nuclear command and control procedures. He revealed the identities of at least 3 Russian officers working secretly for the United States, all of whom were executed. He exposed the $100 million embassy tunnel project in Washington, designed to intercept communications from the Soviet compound. He handed over technical manuals for U.S. electronic surveillance systems, providing Moscow with the means to shield itself against American eavesdropping. Hanssen communicated with his handlers almost exclusively through letters, signed with his alias Ramon Garcia. Those letters, recovered after his arrest, show a curious mix of arrogance and paranoia. He lectured his Soviet contacts on proper spycraft, chastising them for risky behavior. He insisted they never attempt to meet him face to face, never photograph him, never force him into exposure. He boasted about the access he had to America's most sensitive files, but he also downplayed his need for money, framing his actions as partly ideological, partly personal gratification. Yet the diamonds and envelopes of cash he accepted tell another story, one of greed. The Soviets, and later the Russians, paid him more than $1.4 million across 2 decades. Some of this came in untraceable diamonds, handed over at drop sites, and later found in a plastic bag hidden in his home. Much came in bundles of cash, often wrapped and left for him to retrieve. He never flaunted the wealth in ways that screamed luxury. He drove ordinary cars, lived in a modest Virginia house, sent his children to Catholic schools, but his finances never matched his official salary, and the unexplained deposits, later traced by investigators, stood as silent markers of corruption. The 1990s brought new layers to his tradecraft. Technology was changing, and Hanssen adopted digital methods to supplement his paper trails. In his final exchanges with the Russians, he used a Palm Pilot personal digital assistant, loading files encrypted with specialized software. At the time, it seemed a leap into modern spycraft. In reality, it became one of the threads that investigators later unraveled. When forensic teams examined the Palm Pilot after his arrest, they found stored files and communications that confirmed his relationship with Russian intelligence. The device was a relic of a man trying to keep up with a changing age, but it sealed the case against him. His double life played out even in the details of those exchanges. He was meticulous in writing his cover letters, formal, almost pompous. He referred to the bureau in detached tones, as if he were already outside it. He expressed contempt for what he saw as America's arrogance, framing his betrayal as a correction, a counterweight, and yet he also described his actions as proof of his intellectual superiority, telling Moscow that he spied partly to show how clever he was. In one recovered letter, he wrote, "I have come to believe that you value my assistance because it demonstrates that you cannot protect yourselves from penetration by someone you would never suspect." Despite his caution, cracks appeared. He sometimes used his bureau computer to query files unrelated to his assignments, searching for information he would later pass along. These unauthorized searches were noticed but not acted on decisively at the time. Another example of institutional blind spots. He hoarded classified documents at home, storing them in his basement, an act so reckless that colleagues would later struggle to reconcile it with his reputation for conservatism. The Russians, for their part, respected his boundaries. They never pressed him for a meeting. They never risked direct contact. His caution kept him alive in their eyes. To them, he was not just an asset. He was a unique penetration, a senior F.B.I. agent sitting at the heart of American counterintelligence. His code name, in their files, reflected his utility. He was both a source of information and a symbol of American vulnerability. For more than 15 years, this system worked. He left trash bags, picked up envelopes, wrote letters under an alias, carried a Palm Pilot loaded with stolen files. Neighbors walked past without noticing. Colleagues sat in the same office without suspecting. His family prayed beside him at Mass without realizing. The ordinariness of the settings, the routine nature of the exchanges, was his camouflage. When the investigation closed in around him, these same routines became evidence. Surveillance teams documented his trips to Foxstone Park, noted the signals on poles and signs, photographed him leaving packages. When he was arrested in February 2001, the bag under the bridge contained documents ready for his Russian handlers, proof in his hands, caught at the act. It was the end of his tradecraft, but the beginning of the Bureau's reckoning. The first operation shattered by Hanssen's betrayal was not an abstract system or a surveillance device, but people, human beings, with names and families. In the mid-1980s, the Soviet military intelligence officer Dmitry Polyakov, a major general, was one of America's most valuable assets. He had been providing information to the United States since the 1960s, details on Soviet weapons, doctrine, and diplomacy. Polyakov was described by CIA officers as the jewel in the crown of U.S. human intelligence. Both Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen gave Moscow his name. By 1988, Polyakov was arrested, tried in secret, and executed. His fate was sealed by the convergence of betrayals, and his death became one of the darkest symbols of the era. Another casualty was Valery Martinov, a KGB officer secretly working for the F.B.I. Martinov had been recruited in the late 1970s, feeding information from inside Soviet structures. In 1987, he was arrested, interrogated, and later executed after Hanssen revealed his role. Alongside him, Sergei Motorin, another KGB officer secretly working for the Americans, was also betrayed and killed. The pattern was unmistakable. Men who had risked everything to aid Washington were being systematically eliminated. The loss of these agents created ripple effects. Networks inside Moscow dried up. Recruitment became harder. Fear spread among potential sources who saw that even the highest levels of American protection could not guarantee safety. The human cost of Hanssen's treachery is difficult to calculate in numbers, but at least 3 lives were lost, and many others compromised, careers destroyed, families torn apart. Beyond lives, there was infrastructure. One of the most ambitious counterintelligence operations of the Cold War was the construction of a tunnel under the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., known internally as Operation Monopoly. It cost tens of millions of dollars. The tunnel ran beneath Wisconsin Avenue, lined with sensors and microphones designed to capture Soviet communications. It was a feat of engineering and secrecy. Hanssen exposed it almost immediately after learning of its existence. To Moscow, this was confirmation of long-held suspicions. To the FBI, it was a humiliation. After his arrest, inspectors found that the Soviets had likely known of the tunnel for years, neutralizing its value. Hanssen also passed along technical manuals on U.S. electronic surveillance systems, crippling America's ability to listen in on Soviet military and diplomatic channels. He revealed the identities of double agents not only in Moscow, but also in other countries where Soviet officers operated. The damage assessment compiled after his arrest was blunt. He compromised dozens of operations, revealed multiple surveillance projects, and gave Moscow a comprehensive view of how American counterintelligence functioned. For the FBI and CIA, the fallout was bewildering. By the late 1980s, it was clear that leaks were devastating operations, but identifying the source proved elusive. Investigators launched internal reviews, polygraphed suspects, and chased red herrings. At one point, suspicion fell on a CIA officer named Brian Kelly, who endured years under a cloud of accusation before being cleared. Kelly's ordeal illustrates how damaging misdirected suspicion can be. While the real mole, Hanssen, sat unnoticed in his cubicle. The mole hunt intensified in the late 1990s. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. Russian intelligence continued to anticipate American moves. Operations collapsed without explanation, and insider leaks were the only plausible cause. The Bureau and the agency established a joint task force, bringing together specialists in surveillance, forensic analysis, and behavioral profiling. One key break came from Russian files themselves. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Western intelligence services gained partial access to fragments of KGB and FSB archives. In those documents were references to an American source, codenamed, whose behavior matched patterns that narrowed the field. The descriptions included the use of chalk marks, the alias Ramon Garcia, and specific drops in Virginia. Analysts compared those details to known Bureau employees, and Hanssen emerged as a prime suspect. Surveillance teams began tailing him. They documented his routines, his trips to Foxstone Park, his signals. Forensic examiners reviewed computer activity, noting unauthorized searches and downloads. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came when the Bureau obtained a file from Moscow that included a plastic bag with Hanssen's fingerprints, proof he had touched material given to the Russians. The counter-operations were methodical. Agents planted microphones near his office, monitored his financial records, and mapped his movements. They knew they had to catch him in the act, with evidence undeniable in court. By early 2001, the plan was set. They followed him to Foxstone Park, watched as he carried the garbage bag under the bridge, and then moved in. He was arrested on February 18, 2001, after more than 2 decades of betrayal. His capture was not a triumph free of embarrassment. The Bureau had to confront how one of its own had evaded detection for so long. The lessons were harsh: inadequate financial vetting, blind trust in devout reputations, over-reliance on polygraphs, and bureaucratic inertia all contributed to the delay. Congressional hearings later probed the failures, demanding reforms to tighten background checks and oversight. The case was a scar on the Bureau's reputation, but it also forced change. Espionage has always had an economy. For Robert Hanssen, the sums involved were at once immense and oddly modest. Over 2 decades, he received more than $1.4 million in cash and diamonds from the Soviets and later the Russians. Compared to the billion-dollar defense budgets he compromised, or the trillion-dollar stakes of Cold War geopolitics, this was a pittance. Yet for the Russian services, it was a remarkably cheap investment. For just over $1 million, they acquired access to the inner workings of American counterintelligence, sabotaged operations, and eliminated double agents who had taken years to cultivate. The transactions were stark in their simplicity. Hanssen would leave documents in dead drops, and in return his handlers would deposit envelopes of cash or small packets of diamonds in locations marked by signals. He once received $50,000 in a single drop. Another time 3 uncut diamonds worth several thousand each. When investigators later searched his house, they found the diamonds wrapped in a sock, hidden away, as if he himself did not quite know what to do with them. Despite these payments, Hanssen never lived ostentatiously. His modest suburban house, his used cars, his frugal lifestyle left neighbors with no hint of hidden wealth. The money funded private school tuition for his children, occasional renovations, and savings accounts, nothing that screamed betrayal. The economics of his treachery went beyond personal gain. For Moscow, Hanssen's intelligence was capital. Every file he delivered could be weaponized. Lives of American assets inside Russia were traded away. But beyond those losses, the material gave Moscow bargaining chips in diplomatic and military negotiations. If the United States pressed too hard on arms control, Russian negotiators could draw confidence from their knowledge of how much Washington truly knew about their capabilities. In prisoner swaps, Moscow could bargain from a position of certainty, aware of which American demands were hollow because Hanssen had already exposed the assets in question. Washington, for its part, faced political fallout each time a compromised operation collapsed. Allies who had shared intelligence grew wary. If the Bureau could not protect its own files, what assurance could it give to foreign partners? Within NATO meetings in the late 1980s and 90s, quiet conversations revolved around the reliability of American counterintelligence. These were not just abstract diplomatic embarrassments, they had practical costs. Some European services limited the intelligence they shared, fearful it might flow straight back to Moscow through an American mole. Hanssen's espionage also intersected with propaganda for the Soviet Union. Revelations that US spies had been caught and executed reinforced the image of state security as omniscient. For Russian media, long after the Cold War ended, the capture of Hanssen became a counter-narrative, proof that even the mighty F.B.I. could be fooled for decades. In speeches and publications, Russian officials highlighted the case as evidence of American hypocrisy, a nation quick to condemn others for corruption, while harboring its own traitors at the highest levels. At the domestic level, Hanssen's finances triggered reforms. After his arrest, congressional hearings revealed how rarely the Bureau had conducted financial reviews of its senior agents. Paychecks were compared, but deep audits, bank accounts, investments, unexplained assets were infrequent. Hanssen exploited this gap, depositing cash in small amounts, moving funds carefully enough to avoid alarms. The Inspector General's report, after his arrest, recommended sweeping changes, routine financial vetting, mandatory reinvestigations of security clearances, tighter controls on who could access which files. Even the religious and ideological dimensions of Hanssen's life carried political resonance. His devout Catholic persona, his affiliation with Opus Dei, his public moral conservatism, all stood in jarring contrast to his secret life. Critics of the Bureau argued that this public religiosity had shielded him from suspicion, that supervisors assumed a man so outwardly devout could not possibly be corrupt. It was a sobering lesson in how personal reputation can distort institutional vigilance. Meanwhile, Moscow carefully managed the intelligence it had acquired. Not every file Hanssen delivered was acted on immediately. Some were held in reserve, information to be released or used years later. When negotiations required leverage, declassified analyses suggest that Russian counterintelligence occasionally preferred to sit on certain details, allowing US operations to continue under their observation rather than shut them down abruptly. This approach maximized the strategic value of Hanssen's material, turning his betrayal into a long-term investment. The political economy of espionage is measured not just in dollars, but in trust, leverage, and time. Hanssen's actions corroded trust among allies, gave Moscow leverage at the negotiating table, and bought Russia time to restructure its defenses after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For America, the cost was incalculable. One intelligence assessment after his arrest concluded bluntly, Hanssen provided the enemy with a roadmap to US counterintelligence. The financial compensation was trivial compared to the damage inflicted. By the mid-1990s, whispers of a mole had turned into near certainty. Something was still bleeding operations, even after Aldrich Ames was exposed in 1994. The CIA and F.B.I. both believed that Ames had explained the bulk of the damage, yet the hemorrhage of information did not stop. Russian services continued to anticipate American moves, continued to blunt operations before they matured, continued to walk with confidence that should not have been theirs. That persistence was the clue. There was still someone inside. The Bureau formed a dedicated mole hunt team, a joint F.B.I. TIA task force, operating in quiet offices in Washington. They reviewed case files line by line, compared collapsed operations, and cross-referenced descriptions from Russian archives with the profiles of American insiders. At first, suspicion fell heavily on CIA officers. Brian Kelly, a counterintelligence specialist, endured years of suspicion and surveillance. His life was turned upside down. His career stalled. His reputation strained. He would only be exonerated after Hanssen's arrest. A bitter irony that a loyal officer suffered under the weight of suspicion, while the true traitor walked free. The turning point came when US intelligence obtained access to Russian material that referenced an American mole codenamed, described with tradecraft details that matched Hanssen's patterns, chalk marks, alias Ramon Garcia, dead drops in Virginia. It was a mosaic that began to align too neatly. Investigators also obtained a discarded Russian file containing fingerprints and voice recordings tied to the mole. When analysts compared the fingerprints, the match to Robert Hanssen was undeniable. Once suspicion focused, surveillance tightened. Teams tracked Hanssen as he left his Vienna home, as he drove to work at Bureau headquarters, as he lingered in Foxstone Park. They planted hidden cameras and microphones near his office, monitoring his conversations. His use of Bureau computers was flagged, repeated queries into systems outside his immediate duties, always probing, always looking. Each detail added weight to the case. Hanssen himself seemed to sense pressure, though he never guessed how close the circle had grown. He became more irritable at work, more controlling at home. He lectured junior agents about loyalty, about vigilance, about the dangers of betrayal, even as his own betrayals mounted. His devout persona intensified, perhaps as self-disguise, perhaps as guilt, kneeling in pews while preparing his next delivery to Moscow. The Bureau faced a difficult choice, whether to arrest him immediately and risk losing full proof, or to wait and catch him in the act. They chose patience. The plan was to let Hanssen make one more drop, to gather evidence so direct that no defense could deny it. The stage was set for Foxstone Park. On February 18, 2001, Hanssen drove to the park carrying a plastic garbage bag filled with classified documents. Surveillance teams shadowed him, recording each step. He parked his car, walked to the footbridge he had used many times before, and crouched to place the bag underneath. It was an act he had performed countless times, ordinary to him, invisible to passers-by. But this time, the park was not empty. F.B.I. agents closed in, surrounding him as he turned back toward his car. The moment of arrest was almost anticlimactic. He did not fight, did not run. He reportedly said, "What took you so long?" A bitter echo of his arrogance. In his car and on his person, agents found classified documents prepared for delivery. At his home, they found caches of diamonds, files, and his Palm Pilot with encrypted data. The evidence was overwhelming. The collapse was immediate. Within hours, Bureau leadership was briefed. Within days, the story reached the press. The headlines were brutal. F.B.I.'s agent charged as Russian spy, most damaging mole in Bureau history. Inside the Bureau, shock gave way to anger and then to shame. This was not just a mole. This was a senior counterintelligence officer, trusted with the nation's deepest secrets, who had betrayed everything. Hanssen's trial never went to full contest. In July 2001, he struck a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He pled guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy. In return, his wife Bonnie retained part of his pension to support their children. In May 2002, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, confined to the maximum security federal prison in Florence, Colorado. There he remains, cut off from the world he once manipulated. For the Bureau, the collapse forced a reckoning. Congressional hearings probed how Hanssen evaded detection for so long. The Inspector General's report cited failures in financial monitoring, weak polygraph programs, and cultural blind spots. Recommendations followed: routine reinvestigations, tighter compartmentalization of access, better coordination with the CIA. Yet, reforms could not erase the embarrassment, nor bring back the lives lost. The irony of Hanssen's collapse is that it came not through dramatic exposure, but through ordinary surveillance, fingerprints, and patience. The same dull, methodical craft he had used to betray his country was turned back against him. The same parks and bridges that had been his shield became the scene of his downfall. His empire of secrets, built over 2 decades, collapsed in a single February afternoon. The arrest of Robert Hanssen did not end with a courtroom plea and a prison sentence. It rippled outward into institutions, into politics, into memory. In the months after February 2001, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, F.B.I., underwent one of its most painful self-examinations. Congressional hearings demanded to know how a mole could operate for more than 20 years without detection. Families of executed agents asked why their loved ones had been placed in harm's way. Allies pressed Washington for reassurance that intelligence shared in trust would never again be compromised so deeply. The Inspector General's report, released in 2003, was unsparing. It concluded that Hanssen's activities were not merely the product of a clever spy, but of systemic weaknesses. Financial vetting had been inconsistent. Internal security clearances were rarely revisited. Supervisors failed to act on suspicious behavior, including Hanssen's repeated access of files outside his assignments and his hoarding of documents at home. The Bureau had trusted the image of the devout Catholic family man and that trust had become a blindfold. Reforms followed. The Bureau introduced mandatory periodic re-investigations of all employees with access to classified material. Financial disclosures were tightened. Polygraph programs were expanded, though debate about their effectiveness continued. Perhaps most importantly, the Bureau began embedding counterintelligence training across all levels, emphasizing that no one was above suspicion. The Hanssen case became a cautionary tale taught to new agents, a reminder that betrayal can come from the man at the next desk. The cultural reckoning was more complex. Within his parish, some parishioners struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the traitor described in headlines. Hanssen had knelt in pews, led Bible study, spoken of morality, all while carrying secrets that cost lives. His wife Bonnie, blindsided by the arrest, testified that she had no knowledge of his activities. The plea deal preserved part of his pension for her, but she was left to navigate the stigma of being the spouse of America's most damaging mole. His children grew up in the shadow of that legacy, their father's name synonymous with betrayal. In the intelligence community, Hanssen's name became shorthand for failure. To say an agency had another Hanssen was to suggest a rot from within. Training manuals cited him as an example of insider threat, not just for the information he passed, but for the personality traits that enabled it: arrogance, secrecy, grievance. The lesson was stark. Devotion on the surface can conceal disloyalty underneath. Museums and archives began curating his story. The International Spy Museum in Washington exhibits material linked to his case, his Palm Pilot, documents, and stories of Foxstone Park. Declassified files from the Bureau are studied by scholars, dissecting the mechanics of his espionage. In public memory, his case sits alongside those of Aldrich Ames, the Cambridge Five, and John Walker as one of the most catastrophic betrayals in Western intelligence history. Popular culture did not ignore him either. Books, documentaries, and dramatizations appeared. Breach, a 2007 film starring Chris Cooper as Hanssen, portrayed the final weeks of his career, dramatizing his paranoia and control. Television specials revisited the case, each emphasizing a different angle: the family man, the devout Catholic, the bureaucrat, the traitor. In every telling, the same irony surfaced. A man obsessed with control lost everything because of his own arrogance. In the prison at Florence, Colorado, Hanssen lives under special administrative measures, cut off from contact, serving life without parole. He is not permitted to give interviews, his communications tightly controlled. The silence of his confinement is its own echo of the silence he imposed on others, the silence of networks collapsed, of agents executed, of operations dismantled. For historians, the case remains a prism through which to examine the end of the Cold War and the vulnerabilities of great powers. Hanssen did not bring down an empire, but he revealed how fragile trust can be inside one. His betrayal showed that ideology, money, ego, and grievance can combine in ways that no clearance system can fully predict. It also showed that institutions must evolve, because the threats they face often come not from without, but from within. Today, students of intelligence walk through exhibits, read declassified transcripts, and pause at the photograph of Hanssen in handcuffs, glasses on his face, his head turned slightly as agents lead him away. It is not just the image of a man undone, it is a warning. The greatest damage is often carried out not by the enemy you see, but by the colleague you trust.